Hey everyone, it's Ed Gutowski. What I wanted to do was to create our first lecture, which is on rhetoric and argument. And the rhetoric and argument tends to be really the best part of class. Students love the rhetoric and argument portion of class, whether it's online and it's on ground. So we're going to start our class talking about rhetoric and argument. And the first thing you should know is that rhetoric and argument are linked. You can't have one without the other. So before we can talk about an argument, we need to talk about rhetoric. And so generally in a ground class, I can break up students into three groups. First of all, there are the students who say they've never ever heard of the term rhetoric before. Then there's a group of students who say they've heard the term rhetoric, but they don't know what it means. And then there's the cocky students who can come up with a definition of rhetoric. So if you're in that position where you've never heard the term rhetoric before, it's okay, you're in the right spot, because what we're going to do is we're going to kind of slow down, kind of help everyone understand what rhetoric is, and then we can start analyzing it in a little more detail. So if you're in a position where you've never heard the term rhetoric, you're not familiar with it, you're in the right spot. So the first thing that I do to help students understand rhetoric is I ask students, is it safe that we can say that people use rhetoric? And most students, even if they've never heard the term rhetoric before, say, hey, yeah, at least I know that people use rhetoric. So let's figure out who those people are. So there are two groups that students can always associate with rhetoric. And the first group is politicians. Politicians are always associated with rhetoric. So if you think about it, in the last couple of years, you might have heard something like Donald Trump is using rhetoric. I don't know what that means. It went one ear out the other, but okay. Right? And more recently, you might have heard things like President Joe Biden is using rhetoric. So it's safe to assume that we know politicians use rhetoric. The second group that's always associated with rhetoric is lawyers. For whatever reason, students always associate lawyers with the use of rhetoric. And as we get through the process of understanding it, it will make sense why lawyers would be very good at using rhetoric. Well, if we know that politicians and lawyers use rhetoric, then students can say things, well, wait a minute, don't philosophers use rhetoric? Wasn't Aristotle and Socrates associated with rhetoric? So philosophers use rhetoric. That also leads into a slippery slope where we can say, well, then teachers use rhetoric. Well, if teachers use rhetoric, that means students use rhetoric as well, and sometimes they're not very good at it. Then the last group that sometimes students might come up with, they'll say writers use rhetoric. So all we've done is establish at the ground rules that we know that there are people who use rhetoric: politicians, lawyers, philosophers, teachers, students, and writers. So now I want to talk about forms of rhetoric. So I want you to imagine if you were in luck and right behind me, right behind this tree, came out former President Barack Obama. And here he is standing up behind this tree, and he's going to use rhetoric. What's he doing? And well, students will say, well, he's talking. And I'll say, let's get more specific. Well, he's giving a speech. So you'll notice that a form of rhetoric can be a speech. Speech can be a form of rhetoric. And if you think about it, that's how most people communicate, politicians communicate, it's through speech. And then in ground class, I like to ask students, well, hey, how many people have seen former President Barack Obama give a speech live in person? And most students say no, but every once in a while I'll have a student who will raise their hand. Maybe they've seen him give a speech because they served in the military. And I say, well, how is it possible that you've seen a politician speak but not live in person? And they'll see things like radio or TV. So notice, radio and TV can be a form of rhetoric. Well, if radio and TV can be a form of rhetoric, we could also think about the internet could be a form of rhetoric, or emails might be a form of rhetoric. If we think about writers are the people who use rhetoric, that means, that newspapers, magazines, or books would also be a form of rhetoric. So what we've just done is we've established the following. We've established that there are people who use rhetoric: politicians, lawyers, philosophers, teachers, students. We've talked about forms of rhetoric, and these forms of rhetoric can be used to communicate a message, such as a speech, TV, radio, internet. Maybe a journalist might use a magazine or a newspaper. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you my definition of rhetoric. And my definition of rhetoric is words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and to con people. So I'm going to start our first week of class defining rhetoric as words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and con people. So here's what I want you to do. There's a discussion board that's going to have you look at rhetoric in a little more detail. You can watch this video. There are 2 other videos just to give you a broader sense of what rhetoric is. And in that discussion board, I want to know how you would define rhetoric. You can agree with me, you can disagree with me, but I'm still going to hold as of week 1 that rhetoric is words used to manipulate, deceive, and con people. But I want to know, based on this video and the other videos, how would you define rhetoric and why? And from there, we'll have kind of a foundation to build things. So I'm looking forward to see how you define rhetoric, and week 1 is going to be a lot of fun.